Thank you all for coming out. I'm Ben White, Politico's chief economic correspondent. I write a morning column called Morning Money that if you all would like to subscribe to, just see me after. I'll tell you how to get it. And make sure you're signed up for that. It covers the intersection of Wall Street and Washington. We've got a great panel to talk about investing in America, to talk about our debt and deficit, tax reform, all the other important things that don't ever seem to get done in Washington, but we hope eventually might get accomplished. I'll introduce our great panel. MacGuineas is president of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget and the Campaign to Fix the Debt. Senator David Perdue is a U.S. Senator from Georgia. You all know Mark Warner, Senator from Virginia. And Mark Weinberger is the global chairman and CEO of Ernst & Young. Great set of perspectives on these issues. And I thought we'd just tee it up with Maya to talk about where we are right now in terms of the U.S. federal deficits, the size of the debt. And my question for you is, it's sort of become uncool in both parties to talk about entitlement reform and long-term debt reduction.
And uncool at the Institute this week, too.
We're going to send Mark out to start dragging people in a little while. He's going to wrangle some folks for us. But, important issues that we'll talk about. And so, Maya, you've got Bernie Sanders on the left talking about spending enormous amounts of new money on free college and universal health care, pulling Hillary Clinton to the left to a degree on some of those issues. And on the right, you've got Donald Trump saying, I can cut your taxes $10 trillion while also not touching Social Security, Medicare, maybe even expanding these things. So long-term debt and deficit is not on the table right now in the 2016 presidential campaign. Where are we? Why aren't we talking about this?
Great. Okay. Well, you kicked it off perfectly. The state of the debt is actually really bad, but you wouldn't know that from how people talk about the issue. So just kind of a couple anchoring facts. The debt as a share of the economy is twice our historical average. It's twice where we were when we went into the 2008 crisis. And it's the highest it's been since we came out of World War II. So it's stunningly high. But the story that we've been hearing recently, and this is combined with the fact that I think people are tired of the issue, and there's fiscal fatigue across the country because we tried to fix it so many times, and whether it was fiscal cliffs or Boehner-Obama negotiations, things just didn't get done. But the fact is that we right now have a situation where you have politicians who are talking about, oh, this is great, the deficit came down. President Obama in his State of the Union has said, we cut the deficit by 2/3. The deficit is the short-term problem. It's how much we borrow every year. It was expected to come down while the economy was recovering, but the story is the fact that that debt continues to grow every year. It's on track to grow faster than the economy forever. And that leaves us in a situation where things like interest payments are now the fastest growing part of the budget. So you have you can't argue against the fact that the fiscal picture is bad, dire, I would say, and all you have to do is read a Congressional Budget Office report to see that. But you have politicians on both sides of the aisle, luckily not the ones who are with us today, but a lot of them who really want to run away from the issue. And the reason is because fixing the debt takes hard choices. There's no getting around. You have to control spending. You have to reform our major entitlement programs, and you have to raise revenues. There are a lot of different ways to do that, but you have to do all of those. You also have to grow the economy, and fixing the debt is part of growing the economy. So the hope was we would have a presidential campaign where we would talk about this in a way that would set the stage so we would do something, right, shaking your head. We could not be in a worse situation in terms of what we're actually talking about in the campaign, where on the Republican side you have candidates who talk about the issue, and then put forth a bunch of proposals where the range of what it would add to the debt is above $10 trillion over 10 years. That's stunning. Tax cuts in the neighborhood of $10 trillion when just 4 years ago Republicans were talking about revenue neutral tax reform. That's a big step backwards. And on the Democratic side, you have candidates who have massive proposals to expand government. Sanders is certainly much larger than Clinton, but both of them are talking about government expansion. They are talking about paying for those plans. Those Sanders numbers fall incredibly short. But they are not ever even mentioning the deficit and the debt. And they have so many things that they need to do to pay for their new plans. There's literally nothing left that you could really credibly do to put together a debt deal. The Sanders plan calls for tax rates, that are so high that even liberal economists say you're kind of at your revenue maximizing level. You couldn't raise tax rates more to raise more money. So I leave it to the other three panelists to tell you how we're going to get out of this situation. But we are in a national dialogue that is moving absolutely in the wrong direction. And don't believe it when you hear good news about the state of the debt, because we really are facing huge challenges, particularly with the aging of the demographic aging in this country, the baby boomers are moving into retirement. We have our work cut out for us.
Okay, I'm going to recommend when we move in further into the panel that you guys can talk to each other and interrupt each other and argue with each other all you want. I'll continue sort of down the road to get things started, but the more you get me out of the way is fine by me. Senator Perdue, I came down, I covered your campaign a little bit in Georgia. You come out of the business community. You ran on a message of fiscal responsibility, deficit, debt reduction, tax reform, getting the corporate rate lower, making the U.S. more competitive on an international taxation basis. You come to Washington, it's got to be a little bit discouraging where the debate is right now, but I know that you're working on certain somewhat bipartisan efforts to address this. Talk to me a little bit about where the Republican Party is now in terms of fiscal responsibility, cutting debt and deficit, and what do you think the prospects are for progress either this year or into 2017. What has your experience been like as a first-term senator?
Well, it's very frustrating, but I knew it would be. There are a lot of well-intentioned people, but as Maya said, and by the way, this enthusiasm is very contagious, and so Maya's been very gracious to help us in the last year to address this. And I think one of the things we've got to do basically is to recognize we're in a crisis. Somebody asked me the other day, says, well, with the financial situation the way it is and the debt situation the way it is, when will we know that we've hit that crisis? I said, I don't know, but I think we're looking at it in the rearview mirror. The quarter point increase that the Fed did in December is $50 billion in new interest. Now, I don't care what side you're on politically, that's a problem. And if interest rates went back to their 50-year average of 5.5%, we'd be paying $1 trillion in interest. As a matter of fact, we pay less actual dollars of interest payment today than we did in 2006, even though the debt is 3 times as large. So we've got a situation here that we're in a full-blown crisis, but to put it in perspective, you've got to talk about the global security crisis too, because they're interlocked. Our ability to defend our country and provide for the national defense is put in great jeopardy. Let me put it this way. About 70% of our budget, about $3 trillion almost, is mandatory. So that means in the last 7 years, we've borrowed 35% of what we spent as a government, and the CBO projects in the next 10 years that we'll borrow over 30% of what we spend as a federal government. Well, that means if mandatory is 70%, that means that every dime we spend in discretionary, that's research, education, foreign aid, military, is borrowed. Now that's the definition of a crisis. You're borrowing money to pay interest, and as Maya said, as the interest line on our income statement grows, or expense statement grows, it becomes the largest growth item besides healthcare in the future 10 years of this. It's a bipartisan problem. Both sides are guilty, and we both have to break through the gridlock to address this thing, and that's the frustrating part. The solutions are readily available. If we lock the door, in the next 2 hours, we could absolutely come up with a plan to save Social Security.
We're not going to do that.
But if we did, we'd have a plan. But then, even then, we would have to fight through the political realities that you have in Washington in this crazy season, as you said, the silly season this year.
Yeah, I want to come back to get you to explain Trump to us and how Republicans have managed to land on him as the likely nominee. I won't let you off the hook on that, but I want to get to Senator Warner and talk a little bit about where Democrats are on this issue. And it's obviously not front and center for the presidential candidates, but it's something that you've worked on for a long time and are interested in. Explain to us where Democrats are. How are you going to fix it?
Well, let me just, first of all, it's great to have David in the Senate. You can read a balance sheet. My partner in the whole efforts working with Maya for 3 years, 2.5, 3 years with the so-called Gang of Six, which was basically trying to implement the Simpson-Bowles plan. He replaced Saxby Chambliss, Republican senator from Georgia. He's a Republican senator from Georgia. Yet on this issue, we see, I think, 90% eye to eye, and he brings a fresh set of enthusiasm to this debate, because you do get worn down at times. We've got lots of factoids. I won't go through my series other than this is both parties' fault. It's not something that happened overnight. For the last 70 years, 65 years, we've run a deficit. It is, as David mentioned, the interest rates now going up. Actually, that spending will choke out military, education, R&D, infrastructure. That's a bad business plan. I don't care which political party you belong to. And I think the single most frustrating point I found when I've been in the Senate, Saxby and I and our so-called gang, again, I work in a very strange place, or Dave and I work in a very strange place where being a gang member is a good thing. Means you're trying to do something bipartisan.
Well, it used to be a good
At least it used to be, I guess. I think we could have actually, I think most members in Congress get this at kind of a base level, even if they don't know the numbers. But it will require both parties to kind of move off their kind of talking points. On the Republican side, the kind of no new tax mantra, we can't get there without new revenues. Out of the 34 industrial nations in the world, America's 31st in terms of total revenue stream, state, local, and federal combined. Yet we've got the world's most complicated tax code with the highest, at least corporate rate. We've got to do international tax reform. I think we will do that next year. Democrats got to acknowledge Medicare and Social Security, probably the best programs any government has ever put in place. But the math doesn't work anymore. It's not actually the politician's fault, it's the doctor's fault, because we're living longer. You know, when I was a kid, there were 16 people working for every one person in retirement. Today, there are 3. It's math, and the Democrats have to acknowledge there's nothing progressive about a system that gives at least Mark and David and I won't say you and Maya, because you're too young, but doesn't charge anything for us for our entitlements. And yet we are strangling programs that invest in children. 24% of our kids are in poverty today. It's tripled. Yet poverty rates among seniors have gone down. We've got to guard against that, but there's nothing progressive that says we won't deal with Social Security and Medicare if we are choking off investments in our kids. So I think there is debt fatigue. I do think there will be a chance next year to start at least on international tax reform. If we don't, we won't have a corporate base left. But it is hard to do these. People said always beforehand, why did you have to do the grand bargain? Why can't you do it in piecemeal? If you just take international tax reform as one piece, it's hard to do international, as Mark well knows, without then dealing with pass-throughs. As much as we want to say we want to make America competitive, think about going back to Georgia or Virginia and saying, we got great news. We've lowered international tax rates to pick your number, 25, 22, 20. You poor Georgia companies that are pass-throughs, you're still going to pay 39.
Right.
So it is hard to do these because they are all intertwined incrementally. But I think we will get forced, and I actually have quite a bit of optimism for the.
So you're saying we need to do corporate and international, or corporate and individual at the same time?
I think that we will start with international.
Right.
And that will then push us a bit into broader corporate, and then obviously pass through. But the urgency of doing international, because I think we will not have a corporate tax base if we don't. Yep. And quite honestly, as somebody who's been pro-business, I have been extraordinarily disappointed. I understand the rules that you've got to maximize value to your shareholders, but on the other hand, some corporate leaders who've ignored the fact that this country has given them 70 years of rule of law, capital markets, education systems, and their willingness to walk away at a drop of a hat has been extraordinarily disappointing.
Well, like I'm going to come back to the senator from Georgia to explain Trump, I'm going to come back to you to explain why pro-business Democrats can't do well anymore.
Wait a minute, I thought you were going to ask him about Bernie.
Well, and Bernie too. You're going to have to explain Bernie, although Bernie is not going to win, whereas Trump is going to win. Mark, give us the corporate viewpoint on the 2016 campaign, where it stands in terms of talking about deficit and debt reduction, but particularly tax reform, and the inability of this Congress to address it in any way, and your hopes, prospects for some type of international tax reform in 2017, and then perhaps broader corporate reform that might include this piece of the individual tax code change.
Do I have an hour for this, Ben?
Yeah. You've got about 5-6 minutes, and we're going to go back down the line.
So thank you. And having been about half my career in government, I feel the pain that the senators are talking about as well, and having worked with these issues forever. I think the two issues are really intertwined. I mean, why aren't we getting to these issues? It's because it's the same in the business community, I think, right now as it is in government, which is that does the person who is having trouble meeting his or her day-to-day living expenses care about the long-term deficit in the United States of America? No. And what this campaign has become about is angry people saying, listen to me, and I want to talk about my issues, and I want to understand how they affect me. When you talk about the long-term deficit, it's really hard to bring that into, even when you talk about trade, People see the factories close down. They don't see the fact that the supply chain of every company in the world right now has component goods from all over, and they would have much higher prices if we didn't have trade. They don't understand that.
Yep.
Business community today is doing the same thing. We've had 4 years in a row of reduced capital expenditures. So we're not investing for the future like we're not investing in the young people for the future. I think the senator said $6 of every government expenditure today for elderly, $1 for the young. That's not an investment for the future. If we're not investing in capital expenditure, then where's our R&D going to come from in a productivity gain to the future? It's going to be really hard. And why are we not doing that? Short-termism. And whether it's activist short-termism in the business community, day-to-day news cycles, whether it's analysts pushing for quarterly results, you've gotten share buybacks, you're getting dividends, you're not getting investment. Well, the U.S. government is doing the same exact thing. They're looking at how do I meet my next year's allocation of what we call discretionary spending, because they have to focus on that with the year. Entitlement program is way down the road. We don't have to understand that. When I was the chief of staff of the Presidential Commission on Entitlement Tax Reform in '93, Alan Greenspan came up to the commission and spoke to us. And he had a really good point. He said, the only way we'll get people to understand the deficit problem, and Senator Perdue hit on it, is that interest rates have a way of bringing future problems to the present. Yep. If people understood the balance sheet of the United States government and really believed that this was a problem and something could just go away, the interest rates would be through the roof. Well, monetary policy has come in and negated every effect on the interest rates. If we had the average interest rate today that we've had historically be about 5.5%. Now we know it's down because of monetary policy and negative and what the ECB is doing in there and Japan's doing everything else. It would be over $1 trillion deficit today because of the interest on the debt component that we've talked about. Right. When they eventually, as they have to, go back to the average rate, we will crowd out, as you heard, every single expenditure there is unless we deal with this problem. But that's all if and when and in the future. Right. And right now, people want to understand how you're going to help me today. And I think that's that short-termism is an issue, whether it's elections, every 2 years and we have to go through this, or whether it's the budget cycle, or whether in business it's a quarterly financial reporting. We have to find a way to get these bigger issues on the table.
Right, yeah. Maya, I wonder if you think, as a lot of people do, that it is going to take some kind of crisis to make any of these changes. And that crisis, it seems to me, would be likely driven by an increase in interest rates that make service on the debt a massive part of the annual budget. Like, do we have to be forced into a crisis situation in which the deficit and the national debt become real to Americans and painful to them in ways when we have to cut spending massively? Is it going to take that to make long-term changes? I mean, do we have to be faced with a cataclysmic debt crisis before we do anything?
I mean, certainly it doesn't have to, but unfortunately it looks like that may be what it takes. So when I took over this job running the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, the first day of the new job, we had a board meeting, and my co-chair at the time, who was still my co-chair, Leon Panetta, said, here's the situation. We're going to tell everybody why we need to make these changes. They are not going to listen to us, and we are going to lose. But when there is a crisis, we're going to be able to say, we told you so. Mm. And I just thought that is like the worst first day inspirational speech. I am out the door. And I fear that that may be true. The other point that he and many people have made is it will either take a crisis or it will take leadership. I'm still holding out that there could be leadership that will change this, but the problem is we really needed to make changes this cycle. Right. The baby boomers, the more the baby boomers move into retirement, the harder it is to make the changes. I mean, the bottom line is budgeting is about trade-offs. And we've been in this conference, I've already listened to so many compelling panels about why we need to be doing more in education, why we need to be doing more in healthcare. And people talk about these things as though they're completely divorced from the fact that we have 2/3 of the budget that is squeezing out all these important public investments that we could be making.
I'm going to jump.
Yeah, just interrupt me.
Yeah,
I'm going to interrupt you because you've interrupted me plenty. Think about the premise of your question. We got to wait for a crisis. Yeah. Wasn't 2011 when we almost defaulted a crisis? Wasn't the fiscal cliff and the shutdown of the federal government a crisis? Wasn't the stupidity of sequestration, which said, let's cut regardless of merit?
Right.
Okay, how much,
can I remember the movie Blazing Saddles?
Yes.
Where the sheriff comes out and says, oh my God, he's going to blow his head off? Yep. Do we really have to go through that as a nation?
But can I say one thing on that too?
So we've had these crises, but unless you also have leadership at the same time that will push us in the right direction, I'm afraid what we keep seeing is we have a crisis, and then people come in with, hey, here's a great idea. Let's cut some more taxes and grow some spending. So the solutions are actually the ones that move us in the wrong direction. So
Can I be even more
leadership that will
cynical,
make-
though?
Please.
I think the crisis was a Washington crisis. I don't think the people outside of Washington really, as much as we talked about it, felt the government shutting down, felt all the things you're talking about.
Right.
Were
I can
not
tell you
things
a
that
lot of
translated
places in my state, down in Hampton Roads, that depend on the Navy, that felt.
Well, yeah, Virginia. Okay, good point.
But there's a political crisis right now, which is no matter what issue it is, whether it's the debt or it's immigration or it's trade or it's guns, whatever, nothing actually can get done. And so the fact is that when we have these moments where there really is an action-forcing moment, we still aren't able to make the real choices that are engaged. And you haven't seen any issue of significance move in Washington in the past couple of years. And in my mind, the debt now, more than anything, actually reflects how broken Washington is.
Yeah.
And so crisis after crisis, until we have somebody who is being willing to stand up and talk about the real choices involved, I'm not sure we'll come up with the right solution.
David,
You know,
jump in.
I got to tell you, this conversation drives me nuts. In any other enterprise in the world, what we've already talked about would absolutely recognize it as a crisis. It's not going to take a crisis, guys. We have a crisis today. It's been here since '08. It's actually been here much longer than that, in my
People
opinion.
don't really feel it.
They don't feel it, but I will say this. I'm a living example. I had never run for office before. I got elected in a state against 3 sitting U.S. congressmen who had been, one of them had been there 22 years, Secretary of State, and I didn't run getting endorsements or anything else, which seems to be the inside baseball way of doing this. I basically talked about the debt, the economy, and jobs, and how all those affected people in Georgia. Because that's why I ran. I saw the need, I saw the crisis, and I saw so few people like Mark in the Senate, or in the House for that matter, who have a business background, who can actually talk about the free enterprise system with any qualifications. So I want to go back to one thing, though. The reality that we have a crisis is felt at home in so many ways. We have a disaffected workforce right now. You know, we talk about the unemployment rate being down, but the underemployment problem has grown dramatically. And actually, the people who are disenfranchised and who have left the workforce because of this recovery, which is the worst in 70 years, we had more businesses last year go out of business than actually were started. That's what people are feeling back home, and they're connecting the dots. What's going on with the presidential, I'll jump ahead to this because I think they're interconnected. The frustration of the people back home is very simple. It used to be that politics were ideological. One side would be liberal, the other side would be conservative, and most America was somewhere in between. Today, a lot of people are voting because they're more motivated by their frustration with Washington and the lack of results than they are their own ideology.
Right.
And this has confused the Republicans, and it's actually confused the Democratic base. That's why Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, I believe, are doing so well.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to one thing. Can we move ahead to 3 charts? Can you pull those up? Bypass the first one. It was very important. Throw the first one up. I'm sorry. I just want to highlight this. This is the problem. If you look at this, blue is Bush, red is Obama, the green is the next 10 years. If we do nothing today, our deficit, these are the annual deficits, will go back to $1 trillion in 6 years. There'll be $1.3 trillion in 10 years. Fast forward, go forward to one more.
I was just going to say, I mean, people get confused about that last chart.
Now we're
going
going to clear
down
that up.
because you had a crisis, you had a
Right.
giant recession.
Right.
So we've improved.
We also talk about the deficit and the
compared
debt.
to those, but
Right.
over the broad sweep of that chart, we have not improved.
Give the president his due,
Yeah.
okay? He says deficits are down. They're down.
Right.
The debt is not down. And the debt, based on what both sides have done over the last 15 years, and the last 100 years actually, this is what's happening in the next 10 years if we don't do something. This is what people are beginning to perceive. Next chart real quick. We're going to go to $30 trillion debt. What I'm trying to get to, I think, is the next one. This is the problem. Like Mark said, for the wrong reasons, we've actually cut discretionary spending by $400 billion over the last 5-6 years. What's not being talked about is the absolute silliness of the mandatory line. The red line there is mandatory. It goes up to by itself, these are constant dollars, in 10 years to $4 trillion. That's what Maya's talking about. But how many things have we talked about since I've been in the Senate that address that red line? 0. That's where the priorities are. And the fact that people back home might not understand it, they're beginning to connect the dots, Ben.
Let me just add one other thing. And again, I give David credit because he saw this and stepped up. I think there are a lot of folks intrinsically kind of in the Senate in both parties. I think, again, we would have gotten 70 votes if the establishments on both sides had not shut down our effort. Mark has been an advocate in this field as well. But we all kind of moan about Washington. I moan about Washington. But Washington, for those of us in the room who are Americans, it's us.
Yes.
I mean, raise your hand if you're involved in any political campaign. I don't care which side. You know, this is the room, and one that nobody showed. You know, we're 1/10 filled of the size of some of the other rooms. This is a room where now about 10% of you, I don't know what percentage are Americans, raise your hands at saying you have any political involvement. You, if you're here, have done pretty damn well, and if you don't have a sense of urgency that you are part of Washington, or your ability, you have an outsized ability to affect what happens in Washington because you're successful. And so I get a little tired with, and again, this is why I give David credit, because he stepped up with business community bitching about Washington, but then never want to get their hands dirty. I mean, we put together an effort that Maya led that was, where the first time I'd seen the business community, Dave and I were talking about this coming over, called Fix the Debt, where we raised some resources so we could, in a bipartisan way, support members who were willing to say we need entitlement reform, we need tax reform that generates revenue. You know, it was probably 1/100th of the business community participated. So you know, what was the old cartoon that said, we've seen the enemy, or maybe it was Roosevelt, we've seen the enemy, it's us. Yeah. So all I'd say is, as frustrated as you get with the political process, if you don't engage, if you turn the keys over to the extremes, I don't think that's going to fix it. And if you say that's not going to, you know, this is interesting, but it really doesn't affect my day-to-day life, echoing what David said, if you don't think the frustration of Americans with our overall system, not just our political system, but our business system, our tax code is at the boiling point, then Katie bar the door. Yeah. The walls that are going to have to be built may not be at borders.
Right.
They may be around neighborhoods the way they are in many third world countries around the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so let me jump in, because I couldn't agree more with what you said, Senator. In fact, when I worked for Jack Danforth many years ago, he said, he had a great line. He said, people think in Washington we're so disassociated, we're so aloof, we're so unconnected to the general public. Nothing could be further from the truth. We all pander to the public, frankly, and we want to do what they want us to do to get reelected in many cases. So I think politicians do listen to the American public, and they should and have to be involved. The problem is when you have candidates on both sides of the aisle attacking the corporate institution as all greedy and rich, and all not paying their fair share. And when whether it's corporate America or whether it's the other party, all the institutions lose trust. Yep. And whatever they say, could you see the business community? We tried this actually. Maya knows this, and she does a great job leading the business community on her campaign for the debt. We're not credible to talk about Social Security and Medicare reform because they think big business is just not paying their taxes. Right. So how would you have a perspective that they want to listen to on these issues? We need to get the trust and confidence back in all the institutions and stop when we have our individual issues pointing at each other and beating them up, villainizing, unless nobody will trust any of us.
Yeah, yeah.
But what Maya does so well, and I want her to speak to this, she just alluded to it a second ago. We've spent a lot of time talking about how to fix this. I mean, that's why I'm giving up a few years of my life to try to go actually be a catalyst to use people like Mark and Mark down at the end to help us fix this. I mean, she's got a set of priorities that I buy into, and we're at the brink, I believe, of being, if we do the right things in the next 3 or 4 years, we could set the next 100 years up for our children and our grandchildren that would actually make the miracle, the economic miracle of the last 70 years, pale in comparison. The ingredients are there. Third world poverty is down dramatically in my lifetime, while poverty in the United States is flat from 65 to today after the Great Society. So there are some priorities if we would get at it. There are things that we can do. She articulates it better than anybody I've heard in Washington. I'd like for her to outline that. I
was about to say, if you could just tell us what those things are. And
well, thank you. I will articulate it probably really poorly after that, so I'll do my best. So, I mean, the way to do this, and what Senator Warner said, was the grand bargain. We had a whole blueprint under Simpson-Bowles which showed you have to look at all parts of the budget. But the grand bargain isn't going to happen. I think it's an unfortunate reality, because if you do it piece by piece, it's harder, because when you go after one piece, everybody else says, why are you going after my piece and not somebody else's? But I think that's where we are.
Could you possibly remind us what was in the grand bargain?
So Simpson-Bowles, or the Gang of Six, and what was great about this was it had a whole deal that was big enough to actually put the debt on a downward path. Now, it used to be, when we were looking at this a while back, our plans were always to balance the budget. And unfortunately, the hole is so big that we're not going to balance the budget in the immediate future. But the trick is you want to make sure that your debt is not growing faster than the economy. You've got to flip those. The economy has to be growing faster. Simpson-Bowles came up with a plan that would have made Social Security solvent, controlled healthcare costs, though I would say if there was one weakness, it didn't do it enough, but luckily healthcare costs have been slowing and not growing as quickly recently. Had caps on discretionary and defense spending, but not nearly as aggressive as the sequester, and would have raised revenue, but through tax reform, meaning lower rates, broader base, not the way that around the fiscal cliff we ended up raising rates. What we did instead, and the key was, it's big enough to deal with the problem, and it really respected the core values on both sides. On the Republican side, that you have to do things that promote growth, that you have to look at how you raise revenues through fundamental tax reform that helps grow the economy. On the Democratic side, that you have to protect people who are vulnerable and depend on the big programs like Social Security and Medicare. And we went through a lot of work to make sure that the bottom quintiles would not be affected and in fact would be better off. If that's not going to work, I think there are kind of 6 steps that we have to think about, and I'll just tick through them quickly. But the first one is we have to stop digging the hole worse. So last year we had a budget in place that was supposed to save $5 trillion over 10 years. And what we did is we passed legislation that grew the debt by $1 trillion. So completely at odds with a budget. We don't even have a budget this year. But we have to have an agreement from members of Congress that they're not going to vote for legislation that grows the debt. The other pieces are pretty straightforward. We've got to deal with Social Security. We have to control health care costs. We have to find a way to raise revenue, again, through pro-growth tax reform is the smartest way to do it. We have to look at how we spend our money in government because it is this number, $6 per seniors on every one for child, which is so short-term oriented. And I know it's hard to look at mandatory spending and Social Security. They're like, different people have protested me, but the one reliable person is my father, who's always like outside screaming, keep your hands off my Social Security. So it's tough stuff. But our consumption budget is 84%. Our investment budget is 16%. That is opposite of where it needs to be. So we have to reprioritize our spending, look at public investments over consumption. And finally, something we have to work on is budget process, the rules of how we actually make our budgets, or start by making them, hold people accountable when they aren't made. There are a lot of things Senator Perdue is really has some great ideas on how to do this. Think about how the budgeting gets done. And the final thing I would say before Senator Warner interrupts me again is there are really important
I'm biting my
ways.
tongue, Mike.
There are really important ways to connect the fiscal issues to the big themes we're hearing this election, which are so important. And we do have to find ways to deal with economic inequality, economic insecurity, the need to grow the economy and have it in a shared way, to have sustainable growth. These things are connected to fiscal policy, and I think that is kind of on us, which is it's hard to connect them, and we need to find a better way. I thought Mark's point was exactly right. Like, you're at your kitchen table worried about how you're going to pay your bills. You're not worried about the deficit, but it does affect people, and so that's a big piece of it.
Let me jump in with 2 points. Very good job, Maya.
Thank you, Senator.
You know, more on the optimism side, because you can get pretty dark in this stuff pretty quick. You always take from your own personal experience. I was governor before I was senator, and in Virginia we had a much smaller but same kind of issue. I was a Democratic governor, 2-to-1 Republican legislature. We had a structural deficit. We cut things, and we put together a Virginia version of a grand bargain. Everybody thought, oh my God, how can this happen? People are going to revolt. We did tax reform, but it net raised revenues. Remarkable thing happened. The state took off like a rocket. It got named Best Managed State, Best State for Business. But the most important thing was the people of Virginia actually felt, because we had a long drawn out battle, overwhelming approval ratings for it happening, because they felt like we'd actually gotten something done. The country so needs a big win. And while they hire us to kind of get into the details of this, putting some points on the board with a big bipartisan win, where we're saying we're going to actually be able to long-term invest in our kids, which people still in our country desperately want to do, would have as much value at lancing some of the boil of all of the bad things in Washington, that it really needs to be a higher priority. Now they're kind of slightly less optimistic, and I was all in on Simpson Bowles, and Maya and I have worked extraordinarily close over the last 5 or 6 years. And I know we need to do international tax reform, but the rates are moving with the rest of the world moving with innovation boxes and patent boxes and other things, and keep lowering their overall rates. I'm not sure that the basic premise that we're going to be able to lower our rates enough and actually increase revenues, we're going to be able to do it. At the end of last year, we did $680 billion unpaid for tax cuts. I think it is time, if we're going to get this fixed and get ourselves competitive on a business basis, we're going to have to think about a new revenue source. You know, whether it's a VAT, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's a debt reduction fee that would go only into debt reduction. But the idea that we're going to magically change this world's most complicated tax system, and I think I want to hear Mark on this.
Yeah.
You and I have talked about this at times in the past. And everyone is for giving up their individual tax expenditures until it comes to their tax expenditure. And we've not seen the willingness, short of a broad-based commission or a BRAC type, but the idea, I've spent a number of years getting on the Finance Committee, and I'm getting on the Finance Committee, and great respect for Senator Hatch and Senator Wyden, but that the committee is going to individually take all the special interests that have been built in and chop them off one by one, short of starting from a clean page. I worry about. There is a reason why every other industrial nation has added a different kind of revenue source.
Yeah.
And we're the laggard.
Yeah, I wanted
and
to-
yet we are, as I mentioned, 6 to 10 points in GDP behind most of our industrial nation competitors in terms of revenue rates. I'm not saying we ought to go to Europe, but at some point facts do matter.
Right. Yeah. Mark, I do want to hear you on the idea of a VAT, a
Doesn't have to
progressive
be a
VAT,
VAT,
as you call it.
It could be a VAT, it could be a carbon tax, it could be a
tax.
debt reduction surcharge
right.
that would go only to debt reduction.
Right.
There's a variety of ways.
But also to Senator Warner's point about the impossibility or unlikelihood that we could compete with some of these other countries that are lowering their core tax rate the way they're doing it, and in the ways that he talked about. Is it folly to think that we could go to 22% or 20% or whatever it is, whatever you think the ideal corporate rate is, and compete with these other countries? There's another way entirely to deal with that, the fact that we are uncompetitive on a corporate tax code basis.
Yeah, so the senator's incredibly articulate on this, and it's the same issue that you have with the budget. I mean, everyone likes deficit reduction in the big course of it, but then when you talk about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, no one likes the cure. Well, revenue neutral tax reform sounds great, but remember, every poker game is revenue neutral.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the same amount of money, but very different pockets, and that's what tax reform's about. You're going to be lowering the rate, taking away incentives, deductions, and credits. Everyone is not a winner until the economy grows, which it will in year 3, 4, 5, not year 1. And that short-termism, again, I mentioned, makes it really hard to look past the first couple of years. So the answer, in my view, is if you want to have revenue-neutral tax reform, it's really hard to get to 22, 23% without some other revenue source, whether it be a carbon tax, whether it be when I was in the Senate, we proposed a business activities tax, which is a value-added tax paid by businesses, replacing some of the corporate taxes. And because in the U.S., we usually pay through the corporate system. We've never had an indirect tax system. And that's another way to do it. There's a lot of ways to do it. But if you wanted to just get rid of deductions, credits, incentives, and lower the rate, your best you'll probably get down to is a high to mid-20s. Right. And the average rate for the OECD countries is 25. And so you're just getting back to maybe normal. And then you get to the real problem the senator identified. Not only do we have a high rate, we are the only country in the industrialized world that taxes our U.S. businesses on all their income around the world after credits overseas. Right. And so, this is driving those inversions. Inversions are incredibly disappointing when companies do them. Well, but let me just say one thing. The only thing more disturbing than inversions is the fact that, one, we make them do it. Nobody wakes up as a CEO in the morning and says, I want to leave the United States and take all the wrath that's going to be on me.
Right. I want to
they
take
are
the political
forced
heat
to
for that.
do this.
Yeah.
And then when we take specific announcements and come out and retroactively try and change the rules on these companies that live by those rules, we are challenging the whole system, I think, in a negative way.
Yeah, this is Mark said we agree on 90%, and we do. Here's maybe part of the 10% possibly. But, I think this is where we need to have that active debate. And the problem is, as Maya said, we don't have a budget process. First of all, the United States federal government does not have a budget. The United States federal government does not have a budget. That's the first reality we have to get to. But I want to come back to...
You and I were both bummed out when we got on the budget committee. I don't think we realized that. I didn't realize that 7 years ago. Budget committee, that must mean something. Right. David asked to be on the budget committee. There is no budget. The Congress, the president doesn't sign it. It is not a law.
We talk about the frustration of people back home. Here's part of it as well. The gridlock. One side wants more revenue. They want tax increase. The other side just merely wants spending cuts. Right. I'm interjecting another alternative, and that is, in addition to those two, you've got to bring the debate about how to get the economy going. And there are two things. Obviously, long term, we need to debate how we fund the federal government. It's out of date. It doesn't work. And the bottom line is that right now we're killing our competitiveness internationally. I lived in Asia. I lived in Europe. I've run a multinational where we had a matrix of the countries we made in, the countries we sold in. And one of the largest things we had to do besides managing FX, foreign exchange, is we had to manage our international tax liability. Well, the U.S. has the highest obvious corporate tax rate, but we're the last one to have this repatriation tax. And instead of finding a tax that we can put on that and deem it to bring it back, which is being discussed by both parties right now, I trust the free enterprise system. There's $2 trillion, almost $3 trillion overseas right now. More than that, there are $4 trillion right here in the United States not at work in this economy. Small banks and regional banks have more cash than they've had in 20 years, and the Russell 1000 has $2 trillion on their balance sheets. That's the largest point in my lifetime. Why are these dollars not at work? Our own fiscal policy is keeping $2 trillion plus out of the country. We need to fix that. I believe right now, if we had any type of long-term consistency and planning of the federal government, we'd have confidence in the CEO community to invest right now. There's a lot of uncertainty, and because of that uncertainty, they're unwilling to invest. So I think it's a multifaceted conversation, not just revenue, not just spending cuts, but I think the big thing again is the mandatory expenses that are going up $1.5 trillion in the next 10 years. That's not manageable. The math just does not work. There is no way that we can fund and carry that debt. Let me say one other thing.
Sure.
The United States government today has 1/3 of all government debt in the world. 1/3. Our consumers represent about 15% of consumption around the world. That says to me that we ought to be talking about how to be important to the other 85% of consumers around the world. The fastest growing entity in the world is third world middle class. We know how to supply their needs, and we're not doing it at the level that we need to today.
Yeah. Senator Warner, why can't we get a deal on repatriation? Why do we constantly talk about this $2 trillion overseas, and we can't bring it back, and there can't be any?
I support repatriation. I support it not as not the craziness of another one-time tax holiday. That's the worst policy. You got to have a toll charge, and you got to set a rate going forward.
I agree.
Here is, and this was Speaker Ryan was not part of this. So let me make it clear. And I'm a fairly equal opportunity blamer, but this is a place where I think the crowd in the House got. The story going around Washington is that there was, again, 90% of a deal. I know, and the craziness of a certain group in the House in terms of the way they saw budget rules was, even though these dollars were going to come back at a much lower rate, this gets really arcane.
Yeah, no, I remember.
It's if you're nerdy enough to be here, you'll follow.
You'll get this. But it's important.
It is. And the Speaker was in favor of this, but the certain crowd, the burn down the House crowd, I call them in the House, said because this new money would come in even at a lower rate, but above the discretionary baseline, and we were going to bring it back for infrastructure. My God, if there's any area where there was commonality of purpose, it was infrastructure. And again, I can give you figures that'll make your stomach even more upset about disinvestment in infrastructure in our nation. And again, fly into Kennedy or fly to LaGuardia, and that's it, or fly into the Bradley here, and you don't need any other statement. But because there was more net revenue above the discretionary line, the ask was that somebody else had to go find other places to cut in either defense or education or research. Now if your eyes are rolling, I can't see with the lights, and that seems a little slightly off kilter, then welcome to kind of what we deal with. Yeah. Until kind of the center in both parties reassert itself a little bit, it's going to be a slog. Yeah,
let me ask you, Senator, why something like that happens, and is that because the Republicans in this group in the House, in the Freedom Caucus, or whoever they are, fear that if they signed on to that, they would be charged with approving a tax increase and then get a primary challenge from a?
I hear that a lot. That's not where the problem is. Let me share with you how silly this is. If you look at the budget process today, if I said today that we have voted in here to eliminate the repatriation tax, we could do that tonight. The problem is that would count as basically a $750 billion increase or $1 million increase in taxes or a loss in revenue. So you got to replace that. That's called scoring inside the budget process. Until we get after that, it's very difficult to have good business decisions made by the federal government. So it's not just that one side has got all the answers. The problem right now is that we can't break through the process. So with Maya's help, and Mark's been helping on this for years, we're trying to change the budget process. We got a process that really doesn't work. We end up in all this drama at the end of the year. Just what happened last year. We pass a CR, we get past the end of the fiscal year, then we do this grand bargain at the end. 8 people get in a room, decide how you spend $1 trillion.
Right.
That can't continue. And we've given the evidence today of why it can't continue. And this goes back many, many years. So I honestly believe one of the frustrations we have right now is because the very purpose of a federal government, the first purpose of federal government, of Congress, is to fund the federal government. And we don't do that. We have all this drama every year, and we end up, the release valve is more spending, more debt. And that's the problem. Yep. And we're not doing anything
and more
to
tax
run
cuts.
and
All
more
those,
tax
tax cuts are spending by another name.
Yeah.
And I agree. One thing that there are models out there. New Zealand had 23 years of deficit spending. They made some of the changes that we're talking about right now of rising up to the leadership to try to get this in the form of a bill and move to change the budget process. And then they had 16 years of surplus experience. Well, what they really did is they put everything on the budget, including revenues, including tax expenditures, everything, including entitlements, everything got on the budget. Right now, the Budget Committee does not address most of the mandatory spending. Social Security is not part of the budget process itself.
Right. We only have about 10 minutes left, so I want to look forward a little bit and maybe stop complaining so much about how crummy things are now, and they are crummy. But let's look at a couple different scenarios.
Crummy, but but let's again take a moment. The economy's a heck of a lot better than it
is.
was.
Yep. 5% employment.
Stock
is
market's
okay.
teetering around 18,000.
Right. Thanks to the Fed.
We do, regardless, we are where we're at,
Yeah.
and we are still, with all of the challenges we've got.
Right.
There are very few industrial nations in the world that wouldn't trade places
Sure.
with what we have in America.
Good points. Fair points.
So-
But the number one thing we have that nobody has is that we can print money. We're the reserve currency of the world. And the minute that changes, everything we're talking about here goes out the window
Well,
because
maybe
our
that's the
formula
crisis
does
we're
not work.
talking about. If we're no longer the reserve
Right.
currency and dollar assets aren't so much in demand, which would be a terrible thing. But let's look at the prospects for what 2017 will look like in Washington, and start with I think what is most people's baseline scenario. If it's Hillary Clinton versus Trump, that Secretary Clinton wins, Republicans maintain the House. Senate, it's kind of on a knife's edge which way that goes. I'm sure we have different opinions on which way it's going to go. But let's say Congress stays what it is. It's Republican-controlled Congress, Democratic president. What are the possibilities for some kind of grand bargain on deficit, debt, and tax reform? Like, we'll just get everybody's response on that. And then we'll look at the Trump presidency and the Republican Congress and what could happen there. But say we have Hillary and Republicans.
So I think the president's first budget really matters. So the president puts out a budget in February, and it doesn't actually matter in terms of that Congress can ignore it, but it's a huge statement of priorities. And what we've seen in the past is President Obama's first budget was all about expanding health care. President Bush's first budget was all about cutting taxes. But if whoever's president, say it's Clinton, goes in there and says, instead of my priorities of government expansion, I am going to try to do something where we work together. It may not be the grandest of bargains, but it will be something where we talk about shifting some priorities, maybe some expansion of EITC in return for some controlling of health care cost, or look at Social Security. There's some pieces of it that could get done. I think there's a chance that you see something very productive in coming out of that first budget. It would involve pulling the leaders in together and saying, we're going to do this in the first 6 months. And part of it would have to be looking at her mandate, which in many ways, I don't think she's talked about this as much as she will, is thinking about investments in children. So there'd have to be some sweeteners in it. I think it's doable, but if I think that whoever's president, if instead they go on their partisan piece, then it's over for the next 4 years.
Same question to you, Senator. Just starting.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think the last model we had where it really worked was actually John Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson became the vice president. He kept his office in the Capitol for one reason. Kennedy wanted an interface with Congress. I think that's the opportunity we have. I think regardless of who is in the White House, I'm more concerned about the 200 or 300 people they put around them in the White House and how that affects both the bureaucrats and the legislators. I honestly think that right now, if you had a president, and I've recognized one thing after just 1 year, and that is it's very difficult to affect macro change from a legislative body. There are too many people going home with self-interest of getting reelected to really drive that. A president, an executive branch, is where I think that power lies, and that's what we need right now. We need a country a president that brings us back together as a country, that works in a bipartisan way, and gets after this debt crisis and recognizes it just as what it is. And I think right now, if Hillary is elected, she's got that opportunity, just like her husband did in '94 when he moved to the middle, formed the Contract of America with Newt Gingrich later, and great things happened. We have that opportunity. We're on the cusp of really turning this around, but we've got to face up to these 2 or 3 really major crises.
Senator Warner, how do you think Secretary Clinton would govern in this regard? What would her first budget look like? And do you think she could bring Republicans along to do the kind of grand bargains that have been
I think there's
mini bargains?
a lot more collaboration in the Senate than most of you think. I mean, I'm a big believer that politics is half policy and half relationships, and you're trying to make sure you get to know somebody, and you got to have that level of trust. Sometimes the kind of party establishments on both sides don't like that level of trust built up, because it's easier than to blame every problem on the other side. David's predecessor Saxby and I would get together. We have these team lunches every Tuesday, or virtually every day we're there, but particularly Tuesday, and we'd get together afterward and we'd say, what did you guys say? Whatever the fight was of the week, we would get 2 completely different fact sets about how the fight came about. So more of this kind of, even if we don't fully agree, the fact that we can talk to each other is terribly important. And President Clinton, if she becomes president, has to really be part of that, number one. Number two, I think the urgency of international tax reform is there. I think the framework of the deal is there. We all kind of know what the bid and the ask is. I think there are some ways that it's going to need to be revitalized, but I think that would be first up. I also think that we need, and Mark has been helping me on some of these issues. I won't get into them today, but we need around not just debt and deficit, but a variety of issues. I mean, even to the kind of core of how business operates in the 21st century, and kind of what the new social contract ought to be in terms of the changing nature of the workplace. We need some new framing around some issues that aren't as much traditional liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. Because almost all the issues that we've talked about, and debt and deficit is one, everybody's kind of already got their position.
Right.
So how you come at this with a slightly different lens may get us to the same part of agreement, but if you start with a new social contract, or you start about what's responsible business or capitalism 2.0 as a frame, they don't come attached with everybody's got a pre-assigned position. So I think some reframing around issues will help us, and to the specifics, international will probably be the thing that leads around
That gets done
that.
first. Yeah, Mark, what is your kind
So
of
quickly,
best case scenario?
Yeah, I would just say before you get to even the next president, I think this lame duck session could be interesting too, because I'm a big fan for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. 40% of the world economy, a huge benefit. You have a president, a speaker, and a Senate leader who all are for it now. They don't have the votes clearly, but next year you're going to have a president who's not for it. So if it doesn't get done, really difficult. So that'll be a really important thing to watch.
Well, you'd have a president who was for it and then wasn't.
Yeah, I know, but they're currently not for it. Maybe that's why lame duck may be interesting, right?
Maybe it's better to do it before lame duck.
That would be even better, but unlikely. So we'll see. Okay. The tax reform, though, I wish I was as optimistic as the senator. I think international by itself is extremely hard, having been through all the wars. I think when the rate's this high and you want to get a complete international reform where you're not going to tax overseas earnings, all the abuse provisions, anti-abuse provisions you have to put in is going to really cloud the scenario. It gets very complicated. If you have rate reduction on the table, it gets more likely. Then you're going to have the president, she's going to have to be willing to do that. And the Republicans won't do it without addressing pass-throughs. So you're going to have her put on the table the overall high marginal rate on individuals, which will be interesting to watch. So hope so. I would just agree with Maya and Senator Perdue. I think more important to watch is the first volley to build a bridge to business, to build a bridge amongst the parties, or is it to continue to go off on your own? That's something to watch for.
Right. Well, you'd think if she'd won, she would need to do that a little bit less, at least in the early days. We have 2-3 minutes to talk about the prospect of a Trump administration with a Republican Congress and what that might look like. I mean, he's obviously all over the map in terms of wanting to cut $10 trillion in taxes, but then also use low interest rates to invest in infrastructure. He gets to this sort of populist, it's not left or right divide that you talked about. But Maya, if Trump is the president, what could he achieve on these things? What would you expect from him? And should we be terribly worried about a Trump presidency in terms of our fiscal future?
I'm going to just pick one piece of that because Senator Perdue is obviously going to explain the Trump presidency.
Yeah, in 2 minutes, 17 seconds.
So it's just my deepest concerns from this campaign are what happened on Social Security, where you have the Bernie Sanders talking about not fixing it, but expanding it. Now, to his credit, again, he talks about how he would improve it somewhat, but he uses all these new revenue to expand Social Security, not in a targeted way, but for people who don't need it as well. And that really concerns me, because if there's a fight over new resources, I think we really need to be looking at public investments. And then even more sort of stunning is that the leading Republican contender, and the Republicans have been the party of entitlement reform, where the Democrats have been talking about tax reform, but you have the leading Republican contender saying, I will fix this, and I will not touch Social Security, and I will not touch Medicare. And these myths that you don't need to make changes to fix these programs have done so much damage by causing us to delay. And the fact that we now have that being pushed along on both sides, I think sets back our ability to fix these programs so dramatically. And the squeeze in the rest of the budget continues to grow, and that concerns me greatly.
You know, as an
You're gonna get the
outsider,
last word.
as an outsider, I've watched political rhetoric my whole life. What I'm concerned about right now is real change in Washington. The inside class, the political class, has never been able to achieve that at the level at which we need to do that today. I'm less concerned about the individual in the White House than I am around the 200 or 300 people they put around them. And I think that's where the fight should be. I am absolutely convinced that, independent of rhetoric, that we need to get after these priorities, and whoever's in the White House, if they don't do that, we're in for a rough ride the next 4 to 8 years. I'm absolutely convinced that people in the United States are going to surprise all the pollsters, all the pundits, all the inside political experts in this election. They already have. And so, again, independent of the rhetoric, I'm absolutely convinced right now that if we could just face these priorities, and I agree 100% with what Maya is saying, they're simple. We all know them in this room. And most people in Washington know them. The problem is the political will to break through this drive to get reelected that exists in the Senate and the House is what's keeping us from doing that. So whoever's in the White House, I think they've got to bridge that gap. I agree, Mark, they've got to bridge the gap with business. But I think right now, more than anything else, we need to reestablish ourselves and what our credibility is with the rest of the world, too, because that's what's driving our financial equation right now. They're the people loaning us the money.
Yeah. Well, hopefully some of these things can actually get done
I had a
under
short
either
answer on
president.
Trump.
Okay, go give it to us.
I don't have the foggiest idea.
Yeah, what he's going to do. Nobody else does. Maya MacGuineas, I want to thank you, Senator Perdue, Senator Warner, Mark Weinberger. Thank all of you for coming. Thanks to Milton.
Thank you, man.
Have a good day.